After logging in with your username and password, this is the first page that coaches will see. Now we are going to enter in stats from a particular game. And to do so, you will click on the Team Schedule button and then pick the appropriate game that you want to enter information in. In this instance, it will be the very first game on the list between Parkway North and Parkway South. So first we will enter in the number of periods played. So you scroll down, and once you see periods played, for a typical football game you would put in 4 as the number of periods played. Now if there's an overtime game, you would go to 5 and then 6 for double overtime and so on and so on. But in this instance we will say it's a regulation football game that lasted 4 quarters. Next we will scroll down to the score by periods, and first we will do the away team. And in this example we will do 7 points in the first quarter, 3 points in the second quarter, 2 points in the third quarter, and no points in the fourth quarter. Now we will scroll down to score by periods for the home team, and we will use 6 points in the first quarter, 8 points in the second quarter, 0 points in the third quarter, and 7 points in the fourth quarter. Now if you scroll back up to the top portion of the page, you will then see that the final score has added itself up, and it indicates a 21-12 victory for the home team. So after you've done all that, then you will go back to the schedule page by clicking the schedule button. Now we will do the individual players' scoring statistics, and to do that we will click on Parkway North, and we will go to the player we created in an earlier example, John Q. Public. Of course you would put whatever appropriate player on your squad that you want to change the stats for. In this instance, John Q. Public had 1 rushing touchdown, 1 return touchdown, and a 2-point conversion in the game. That concludes his scoring stats. So then you would click on the scoring icon, and next we will do defense. After you have entered in a player's individual scoring stats, you will hit the scoring button and scroll down to the next option, which is defense. And here we will enter in John Q. Public's defensive stats from a game. So we'll say he made 10 tackles in a game and had a couple of quarterback sacks. And we'll say he recovered a fumble and had 2 interceptions in the game. And on defensive returns, then he would have had 3 total defensive returns with his 2, and then yardage for those defensive returns, say 9 yards. So that will conclude the defensive stats, and next we will look at the offensive stats. To enter in a player's offensive stats, we will scroll down to offense, and those options will appear under John Q. Public. In this instance, we will say he had 5 rushing attempts in the game, and under rushing yards we will say he had 9 rushing yards. He also will say had 2 receptions in the game, totaling 6 receiving yards. Now if John Q. Public were a quarterback, we could fill in his passing attempts, completions, and passing yards. So in this instance we will say that he had 3 completions in 6 passing attempts for 80 passing yards. And if he threw a touchdown, under quarterback touchdowns we put 1 touchdown, and if he threw an interception we'll say he threw 1 interception. Next we will do returns for John Q. Public, and in this instance we will say he had 1 kickoff return in the game for 8 kickoff return yards, and we'll say he had 2 punt returns in the game for 7 return yards. And as you can see, his defensive returns and return yards are already filled in from doing his defensive stats earlier in the game. Next we will go to the punting and kicking statistics for John Q. Public, and in this instance we will say he had 1 punt for 10 punting yards in the game, and he had 1 kickoff for 9 yards in the game. After entering in a player's individual stats, it's important then to put in your team stats. On the drop-down box, click on Team Stats, and then go to the roster page. Scroll down until you see Team Stats, and then go back up to the option drop-down box there and hit Team Stats. Now in this instance we will say that the team had 10 first downs, And now the next category is third down success. We'll say they were successful 10 times in 10 tries. Next is the total fumbles in the game. We'll say they had 2, and then the total fumbles lost will be 1. Next is the penalties, offense and defense. So we'll say 4 penalties on offense and 6 penalties on defense. Then the penalty yards, we'll say they had a total of 25 yards in penalties. Next is the takeaways, and we will say they had 2 takeaways in the game. Next is turnovers. We'll say they turned the ball over 2 times as well. And finally, you have the time of possession in the game. First minutes, we'll say they had 19 minutes and 15 seconds of possession in a game. In our example, we have shown how to enter statistics in for the same player throughout all of the different categories. Now, when entering your statistics, normally you would enter it in by category. Say defense, you would enter in John Q. Public's defensive statistics. Then you would go to the next player and the next player and the next player under roster, and then so on until everybody on your roster has all of their defensive stats complete. Then you would go to the next category, let's say scoring. You'll complete that with however many of your different players on your roster scored in the game, and you would do that for each individual statistic throughout until you have filled in all of your players on your roster. Now, the only portion where you wouldn't have more than one would be on the team stats, but in each instance you would move on to the next category, fill in all of your players' stats, then you would go on and do that. This concludes our short instruction on how to enter in statistics.